Hi, it's Kirsty Young here. Desert Island Discs is taking its usual summer break, so we thought we'd take this opportunity to showcase just a few programmes from our extensive back catalogue. And as this is a podcast, the music has been shortened for rights reasons. This week, my guest is the writer Malorie Blackman, who I interviewed in 2013. My castaway this week is the writer Malorie Blackman. A prolific and multi-award-winning author, she has powered her way to success not just through talent, but dogged determination and perseverance too. From the careers mistress who told her black people don't become teachers, to the 82 rejection letters she received before she was published, significant parts of her life seem to have been spent proving people wrong. A technology whiz, her first career was in computing. As a writer, her books have tackled challenging themes: bullying, teenage pregnancy, racism and terrorism. Currently Children's Laureate, her own formative years were spent in South London, where as a little girl she went from thinking everyone was her friend to feeling as a teenager that the world was her enemy. She says, "Good stories made me reassess the world and people as I thought I knew them. Great stories made me reassess myself." So, Malorie Blackman, assessing ourselves, I think that's a very tricky thing to do. What would you have put in the introduction that I didn't?
I think that was a beautiful introduction, thank you.
In terms of an assessment of who you are, how would you sum yourself up?
I'm still working that out. You know, there's certain things I think, I'm not sure how I feel about that. So I think it's an ongoing process, but I think that's the way it should be, really.
Children and particularly teenagers are who you specialise in writing for, and I would say that teenagers are just about as tough as it gets in terms of an audience. As a readership, for them, how do you judge the right subjects and the right tone?
I go for, first and foremost, I go for the subjects that I would have been interested in as a teenager, all the topics I'd love to have read about as a teenager. I hated it when people would say, but you won't understand that, or they'd patronise you. So I desperately try not to do that in my books.
And what were you reading as a teenager?
Well, there were very few books for teenagers when I was growing up, quite a while ago. And so I went straight, from the age of 10, 11, I went straight on to reading adult books. And I was lucky because I had a really good librarian, because I was down the library so often. And she gave me Jane Eyre when I was 11. And the first couple of chapters, I was thinking, and then I got hooked. And I loved it so much. And then I read Rebecca, and then I devoured George Eliot and so many others, and then I got into Shakespeare, and I'd read Shakespeare's plays for myself, and I read some highly unsuitable things for 11-year-olds like Jacqueline Suzanne and Dennis Wheatley and Harold Robbins and so on. So,
are you one of those people who can't give a book away once you've read it? Do you have all your books?
I'm afraid I do, yes. We have 15,000 odd books in
What?
our house.
Where do you keep? That's one big house.
It's not actually. They're just piled up all over the floor, and bookcases back to back, and we're in the attic, and every room, apart from the bathrooms, has bookcases in it.
I've read that you're one of these people who likes to learn something new every year. What are you learning this year?
Well, actually, I'm continuing with my Chinese. I started Chinese for a term 2 years ago, and last year it was drumming. I kind of dabble in things. It's a bit dilettante of me, but I do like to kind of do things that stretch my mind, my imagination, stretch my abilities.
Speaking of your imagination, I would think, being the sort of writer that you are, you've imagined your island that you're going to be cast away onto, have you? Yes. What are you picturing?
A tropical island, white sands, blue skies, blue sea, and absolute peace and quiet.
OK, let's listen then to some of the music that's going to accompany you on this rather idyllic-sounding island. Tell me about your first choice this morning. What are we going to hear, Malorie?
We're going to hear Uniting Nations Together by Ladysmith Black Mambazo. Joseph Shabalala is the lead singer, is such a brilliant songwriter. And I just love the sentiment of this, and I love the a cappella sound, and I love the message in this song as well.
Smith, Black Mambazo and Abazizwe uniting nations together. So, Malorie Blackman, you have, well, I've got down here, you've published over 60 books now. How many exactly, do you know?
I think it's about 61 now.
Okay, I'm not going to list them all.
But I stopped counting after 50, to be honest.
Okay, I'm not going to list them all because obviously that would take too long, but I think probably it would be fair to say that you are best known for the Noughts and Crosses series. It is, for those who haven't read it, a sort of dystopian fantasy that is centred on discrimination and racism, and very cleverly it's all in reverse. It is the whites who are discriminated against in the Western world. How much did you mine your own experience for the heart of that book?
Far more than for any of my other books, actually. Callum, the white boy in it, some of the things he goes through are based on real experiences I had. Like the first time I travelled first class on a train and the ticket inspector accused me of stealing the ticket. And that was kind of quite fraught because everyone's looking at me and I was so embarrassed. But I thought, I've bought this. And he was going, where'd you get this ticket from? Where'd you get this ticket from?
Did you stand up to him?
I did in that. I said, I bought it, but it was one of those things where I was absolutely mortified and felt totally humiliated. And in the end, he kind of and walked off. And things like sort of saying to my history teacher, how come we never talk about black scientists and inventors and achievers in history? And she said, because there aren't any. And I didn't know enough at the time, this was when I was sort of 13, 14, to come back at her and sort of mention a few names.
Talking about history, let's talk for a moment about recent history. The third book in that series, called Checkmate, caused a very big stir when it was published in 2005. It was just I think it was a week ahead of the London terror attacks. A female character in your book is being groomed by her uncle to become a suicide bomber. You showed extraordinary prescience there. What occurred
Shocking thing
to you at the time of the bombings, knowing that you had just published this book with that in it?
It's one of these shocking things, because when I was working in computing and I worked in the city, it was around the time of the IRA mainland bombing campaign. And I just remember how terrifying that was, where you'd kind of go to work because you had to. But it was one of those things where you thought, is this the day where I sort of catch a bomb? So, of course, when this happened, there were calls from various MPs who'd never read the book, naturally, that the book should be banned, and I was trying to cash in, etc. And I just thought, cash in, I wrote this. This has taken me 2 years to write.
But in terms of using your imagination to create that scenario, did you feel that you were in touch with something that was possible and likely to happen in Britain? Because so many people felt a sense of extreme shock that we could home grow our own suicide bombers here in Britain at the time it happened.
I think so. I mean, I did that with Noughts and Crosses because Callum does join what he calls freedom fighters, but what society at large calls terrorists. And it was very key to me to present both points of view in that book. And it is this idea of, if you don't feel that you are part of society, that you have a stake in society, it's very fertile ground for extremists to say, well, come on to our side and let's do something about it.
More music then, Malorie Blackman. Tell me about your second disc of the morning. What's this?
Well, this is Redemption Song by Bob Marley, and I love Bob Marley. I love the way it's arranged. It's just him and his guitar, and the words, I feel, are so moving.
Marley and Redemption Song. So, Malorie Blackman, you have said that when you were a young child, you thought the world was your friend. Tell me about where you were born.
I was born in Clapham, and then we moved to Beckenham, so I went to school in Beckenham.
And what do you remember about those very early years?
Going to the park and playing and school, and I remember in my primary school learning French and loving that, and we used to have a piano in a back room, and I used to love sitting there and just sort of tinkering away. My very earliest memory is of my dad buying me a walkie-talkie doll, and he pulled the cord and this thing came towards me, arms outstretched, going, "Mama, Mama!" And I went, screamed my head off, picked it up and threw it in our open fire, and my dad was just staring at me, not knowing whether to laugh or scream at me.
Your parents had come over from Barbados. Your mother worked here as a seamstress. Your father was a bus driver. What was their plan in coming to Britain?
a better life, the same as all the sort of Windrush generation. It was coming to England for a better life and more opportunities for their children. And, I think it was one of these things where you come across and you think it's going to be a certain way and it's not, and it's a struggle. But that said, even with all the things I went through, I think I had it easier than my mum and dad when they came over here. And my daughter certainly has it easier than with me. So with each generation, I do feel things get better.
And they had you here. Your mother gave birth to you here, but you had siblings who had been left at home and were at the plant quite commonly, as it often happened, to bring them over. And indeed, they did come over when they were, I think, 8 and 10.
That's right.
Your brother and sister were. That must have been a massive change for them.
It was. I mean, my sister says now that all she remembers is how grey it was, how cold it was, and how much she hated cornflakes. So, and I was so excited coming back from Heathrow, and I'm sitting in the car and talking to them, and they said they couldn't understand a word I was saying. So I was talking really quickly, and obviously they weren't kind of used to my accent. So,
and you would have been about 3 years old?
My sister's 10, so I'd have been 5.
And you mentioned there sort of tinkling on the piano and enjoying French in school. You were a very engaged little girl, were you? You liked learning.
I did. I still do. That's why I do all these different courses every year. And we had a set of Encyclopaedia Britannicas, which were kind of ubiquitous for black families at that time. And we had books on science and nature, all kinds of non-fiction books. My dad wasn't a fan of fiction books. He thought they were a complete and utter waste of time. And his attitude was, well, it's not real. It's not true. You need to live in the real world, Malorie. And so he refused to buy fiction books. But his thing was education, 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 and read the newspaper and learn facts. And I think he was wrong in that I think I learnt more about people and being able to walk in someone else's shoes and see through someone else's eyes from fiction books than I ever did from non-fiction.
Let's have some more music. We're on your third. Tell me about this disc.
Well, this is Right Said Fred by Bernard Cribbins, and I chose this one because this is the first song I remember listening to on the radio that made me laugh, howl with laughter. And even now, I defy anyone to listen to this song and not have a smile on their face.
That was Bernard Cribbins and Right Said Fred. You knew every single word to that, Malorie Blackman. I'm hugely impressed.
Well, actually, we have a playlist. When we have dinner parties at our house, we have a playlist, and it's kind of soulful music and an eclectic mix of music, but we always put Bernard Cribbins in there somewhere and put it on shuffle.
Now, you've said that when you were about 10, you realised that the world was not happy ever after. Why was that?
I think my mum and dad were going through difficulties with their marriage. I mean, they split up when I was 13, and it was a very acrimonious split. But it was also things that were happening to me. I'd kind of walk down the road and I'd be either spat at, or people telling me to go back to where I came from, and I'd think, well, Clapham, give me the bus fare then. So, it was a hard time. Before, I'd kind of think most people were friendly, and then I kind of went to the opposite extreme and thought that most people weren't, and I didn't believe in happily ever after. I wasn't seeing it reflected in my own home life.
And living through that when you were in your early adolescent years, then it's quite often the case that teenagers will turn it in on themselves. What did you do with that sense of frustration and disappointment and angst about the world?
I started keeping a diary. I didn't realise it at the time, but it was a really good way of getting into that habit of writing every day. But I poured all my feelings into the diary. I would write stories and poems, mostly poetry, in fact. And I kind of felt, God, I can't talk to anyone about this. And some of the stuff in this, full of bitterness and anger. That's how I felt at the time.
Were you encouraged to write at school?
I never got discouraged from doing it. And some of them were quite, if you like writing stories, keep going and we'll kind of give you feedback. So I've always had wonderful English teachers.
In class, were you encouraged to come up to the front and read them out?
I wrote a poem when I was in my junior school called The Jungle, and I remember the last 2 lines, and it wasn't particularly good, but my teacher liked it, and she said, oh, Malorie, you can read this at parents' evening. And she sort of got me to the front of the class and said, OK, read it out then. And I stood there and I wouldn't say a word, and she said, well, go on, Malorie. And I said, I can't. And she said, well, why not? And I said, I'm shy. Oh. And everyone cracked up laughing. And I thought, I'm never going to write another poem again. But luckily I got over it. But it was a sort of horror story in that I loved writing, but I didn't want to share my stuff. But it was the same when I started writing. And I joined a Ways into Writing class. And my tutor said to me, I would never read my stuff out. She'd go around a classroom and then she'd say, okay. And when it got to me, she'd say, Malorie, do you want to read your work? And I'd say, no, thank you, not this week. And every week it was, no, thank you, not this week. And after a term and a half, she got fed up with me and just looked me in the eye and said, Malorie, do you want to be a writer? And I said, more than anything else in the world. And she said, well, then you're going to have to shit or get off the pot, love. And I remember, again, everyone cracking up laughing and me feeling kind of thinking it was funny, but feeling absolutely mortified. But it was the best piece of advice I'd ever received in my life, because it was one of those things about, if you want to do something, go for it. Don't do a Hamlet and dither about. Just go for it.
Let's have some music. Tell me about your fourth choice. What's this?
Oh, well, this is the Flower Duet from Laureate by Dilib. I used to do piano lessons when I was younger and I gave them up. And then I heard this and it made me want to take up the piano again. And it's one of those songs that I hear and it just brings a sense of calm and peace over me.
The Flower Duet from Laureate by Dilib, sung there by Jennifer Lamore with Hei Kyung Hong. So tell me, Malorie Blackman, this teacher, the careers teacher, she said to you, black people don't become teachers.
Indeed, yes. She was the one who had to write all the university references. And so she said to me, well, OK, Malorie, what do you want to do? And I'd had it all worked out. From the time I was 7, 8, I wanted to be an English teacher. I wanted to teach English and impart my love and enthusiasm for English texts. And I said, right, I want to go to Goldsmiths College. I want to do an English and drama degree. And then I want to be a teacher at the end of it. And she just looked me in the eye and said, well, black people don't become teachers. And she said, well, why don't you be a secretary instead? And I looked at her and I said, I don't want to be a secretary. I want to be an English teacher. I mean, no disrespect to secretaries, but that's not what I wanted to do. And then she said, I'm sorry, I'm not giving you a reference for that. And she said, and besides, I don't think you're going to get your English A-level, which is nonsense because I've never failed an English exam in my life. And so I remember looking at her and thinking, well, I'll show you, you old cow. And if anything, actually, it made me work harder. But then she said, I'll tell you what, I'll give you a reference to go and do business studies at Poly instead. And because that's the only thing she would give me a reference for as far as higher education was concerned, that's what I ended up doing.
How do you look back on it now?
For years, for about 3-4 years, I wasted my life hating her because I thought she'd ruined my life. I look back at it now, and if I met her, I would thank her because she did me a favour, because she taught me that if somebody stands in the way of what you really, really want to do, you don't stand there arguing with them, and you certainly don't let them stop you. What you do is you find a way to go around them. And so I went to college and I did business studies for half a term, and then I was ill and I was rushed to hospital and I had to come back down to London to recuperate. So I gave up my place at college, and then I got into Goldsmiths. I applied off my own bat and I got in, and for one reason or another I never went. But the point is, it proved to me that actually I could do it. I could get into university.
You've talked so much, Malorie, about books and school, and I had this idea from when I was 7. What about a social life? Were you a gregarious teenager? Did you have boyfriends? Did you enjoy discos?
Not really, actually. My first serious boyfriend was when I was 19 and he was 24, and he's my hubby. So, so we've been together 30 cough, cough years, but I lived in my head. And I was always getting told off for having too much imagination and for daydreaming. One really embarrassing thing I did when I was sort of 11, 12 is I'd go to school with a a leotard and tights and slipperettes in my bag, sort of a sort of black outfit. And I had this special belt, which I'd adapted, which I called my utility belt. And the idea being that if kidnappers ever came into the school, I would run into the toilets, don this leotard and this outfit, and I would come out and I would do some action, kind of Bruce Lee style, and save the day. And for 2 years, I walked with this uniform in my school satchel.
I wish you'd been my friend. Right.
Even my mum, she just looks at me, she says, "You were always weird."
Let's have some more music, Malorie Blackman. We're on your fifth choice of the morning.
Well, this is What's Going On by Marvin Gaye. And I love what it says. And it's about, you need to walk in someone else's shoes to really know them, but talk to them. Don't assume things. And God knows we need some of this today, because there are so many assumptions made about other people or other religions or other races or cultures or whatever. And it seems to me we're talking less and we should be talking more.
What's Going On, Marvin Gaye. So there you were with your leotard and your specially adapted utility belt, and you decided, Malorie Blackman, that for all your English exams that had been passed and passed with flying colours, you wanted to go into computing. Why was that?
When I was rushed to hospital and had my appendix out, I came back down to London to recuperate, and I gave up my place on this business studies course because it was not for me. And I applied to Goldsmiths. So I had I had an interview. And I got in, and I thought I'll defer entry for a year and I'll go and work and make some money, and then I'll start at Goldsmiths. And I started working at a software house, and I'd never even touched a computer before I started working there.
And when would this have been then?
This is 1981.
How big were the computers?
They were huge, absolutely huge. And I just loved it. And I gave up my place at Goldsmiths and I stayed in computing for 9 years.
Were you secretly writing?
Poems. Not stories, and again for my own amusement. But then when I was in my mid-20s, I had enough of computing. And I thought, OK, what about writing I do? And I tried acting classes for a while, and I was a dead loss. Absolute rubbish. But I used to come up with sort of scenarios for our improvisations. And after a while, it was, "Oh, Malorie, what do you think we should do?" So at the end of the course, the tutor said to me, "Malorie, have you ever thought about writing some of your ideas down? Because you come up with some really good ideas." And that's how I started on my writing classes and kind of try to get into it.
So then when you wanted to take that step out of I'm sure a pretty well-paid job in being a financial markets analyst and in full-time into writing, did you worry about the cash? Did you think, how will I pay the gas bill?
Yeah, it was. And but I was so unhappy. It was taking its toll on me physically and mentally. I started having really bad nightmares. Nightmares where I'd wake up screaming. And I was so desperately unhappy because I wanted to write. I didn't want to work in computing anymore. And so in the end, because Neil, my hubby, could see how unhappy I was, we made a deal that I would take a year off and I'd just write solidly for that year and see if I could make a go of it. But if I couldn't, then I'd have to go back to computing.
So I'm right, am I? It was 82 rejection letters.
That's right, for about 8 or 9 different books.
When letter 83 thudded on to the doormat and it said, "Yes, we quite like what you've written."
Yes.
Tell me about that day.
Oh, wow. I still remember that because every time the postman arrived, I'd go charging down the stairs and it was always, "Dear Malorie Blackman, not suitable for our list," and "No, thank you." And then I heard the postman, I went charging down the stairs, tore open the letter, and it was, "Dear Malorie Blackman, we would love to publish your story." And I just stood in the hall and screamed my head off. I was so thrilled. And my hubby came charging down the stairs going, "What's the matter? What's the matter?" And I said, "Oh my God, oh my God." And I just freaked out. And it was one of the best days of my life. And after my third book was accepted for publication, that's when I gave up my job.
There was a very notable author, I think, who gave you a little bit of encouragement when you went along to have your book signed. Tell me about that.
The Colour Purple by Alice Walker was the first book I read by a black author that featured black characters. And that was when I was 22. That's a hell of an age to get to before you see yourself reflected in the literature you're reading. And I remember she was doing a signing at the Silver Moon bookshop. And I thought, I don't care if I have to queue up all night, I'm going to meet this woman. So I stood there with my hardback book, finally got to the front of the queue, and I said, could you write "Don't Give Up" in it? And she said, I can't write that. What does that mean? And I said, well, I really want to be a writer, but I'm getting so many rejection letters. And she just looked at me and she said, don't you dare give up. And she wrote to Malorie, don't give up, Alice Walker. And I thought, well, I can't give up now. Alice Walker's told me not to. So, thank you, Alice Walker.
Let's have some more music then, Malorie Blackman. What are we going to hear now? We're on your sixth.
Yes, this is The Best Thing That Ever Happened to Me by Gladys Knight. And the reason I picked this is because it's for my hubby, Neil. And that's what he is. He's the best thing that ever happened to me.
Thing that ever happened to me, that was Gladys Knight there. So, Malorie Blackman, how did your mum feel about you marrying, I'm presuming, a very white Scotsman, because he was a Scotsman?
Yes, indeed. I'm so lucky because my mum and Neil's mum, they judge people by who they are, not the colour of their skin or religion or whatever. It's kind of, take people as you find them. And so, Molly, bless her soul, because she died a few years ago, she was wonderful. And my mum's thing was always, as long as he makes you happy and he's good to you, then that's all that counts.
And you have said that you refused to live out the cynicism that would have been understandable and easy to adopt given the treatment that you'd been on the receiving end of, in the street and at school. Did you feel that then sort of being embraced and absorbed by this Scottish family in some ways helped you to deal with the idea that not everybody in the world had a horrible strain of racism running through them?
I felt I dealt with it before that.
Right.
When I was 13, 14, 15, I was a very angry teenager. And I kind of felt, I'm not going to live like that. I was becoming the very people I despised, quite frankly. I mean...
and your anger was stoked by the racism?
It was partly the racism. It was also when I think I was 13 at the time, 12, 13. And part of it was because I was watching a film. I went to the cinema, sat by myself, because I used to go to the cinema a lot by myself. And it was Disney's Robin Hood, of all things. And 3 guys came up behind me, 3 white guys, and 2 of them grabbed my arm so I couldn't move, and the other one sexually assaulted me. And I was so traumatised. I mean, they were laughing and they thought it was a big joke. I kind of managed to get away and ran away with floods of tears and absolutely traumatised. And it was kind of, they were horrible, and then it was all white men were horrible, and then it was all white people were horrible. And I got to the stage where I thought, do I really want to live like this, hating people because of their colour? This is the very thing that I object to when people do it to me. And the thing that brought it home to me was there was a song I really loved called What You Won't Do for Love by, I think his name is Bobby Caldwell. And I love this song. And then I thought, I'm going to go and get his album. And I went into the record shop and I found one of his albums, and he was a blonde guy. And I remember staring at this LP thinking, oh my God, he's white. And then I thought, are you really going to stop liking this song just because this guy is white? And that's when it hit me how far I'd fallen, as though that's when I kind of caught myself and thought, no, this is silly. And it sort of taught me a lesson about you judge people based on how that person is, and you don't generalise and describe their behaviour to like all white people or all black people or all Chinese people or whatever. That's just ridiculous.
Let's have some music, Malorie, then. Tell me about your 7th choice.
Well, this is Sing by My Chemical Romance, and thank you, Lizzie, because she was the one who introduced me to this. I love this song because it says, you know what, you have a voice, and don't let anyone ever take that away from you, and don't be afraid to stand up for what you believe in. And even when you're speaking and people hate you for what you're saying, then if you believe that you have something to say, stand up and say it. And I love that message.
Romance and sing. So, Malorie, just over 50 years then on this earth. As you look back at your half century, are you satisfied with your achievements so far?
I don't think satisfied is the right word. I still feel I have more to do. I still feel there's plenty of things I want to do. I want to kind of try and make my mark. I mean, this is going to sound really silly, but there was a really bad film when I was a child called The Seven Faces of Dr. Lau with Tony Randall. He was playing 7 different characters, and one of the characters was someone called Apollonius, who was blind, but he could actually tell people's futures. And one silly woman goes in and wants her future, and he says, well, basically tells her she's a silly woman and she's never made her mark in this world, and when she dies nobody will ever know that she even existed. She'll be just forgotten, and she's never put a step out because she was afraid of putting a step wrong, and so on. And it's really strange because that bit of that film has always stuck with me, because I thought, surely the point of life is to leave the world a better place than you found it, or even with a smile. You can do it by smiling at a stranger so they feel good about their day. It doesn't have to be huge things, but just about sort of treating people the way you would like to be treated. And I kind of feel, isn't that the point of being on this planet? So am I satisfied? No, but I feel like I'm doing what I want to do. I'm writing, which is, I'm one of these lucky adults who's actually doing something that I love.
And only a few months into being Children's Laureate then, how would you like to make your mark there?
At the end of my 2 years, if one child comes up to me and says, well, because of what you've done, I'm actually reading now, or I'm reading more than I was, then I would feel, okay, I've done some good there. My campaign, my aim is more children reading more. I've always said that. And it's about encouraging more children to read and telling them that there's so many fantastic books out there. So if you don't like reading, you just haven't found the right book for you yet. And it is about letting children and teenagers discover books for themselves. And they have the absolute right to read books more than once. And they have the absolute right to put a book down after 3 chapters. I really firmly believe that. That's what will encourage them to know that books are there for them and their friends, and it's not about, we've got to read this and we've got to read that. They get enough of that when they're doing exams.
Now, you as the dreamer, you as the person whose imagination is floating away, you on a desert island, will you be in any sense practical? Will you be able to build a shelter?
Because one of the books I used to carry around for years was the SAS handbook. It was a little pocket handbook. So it was all about if you find yourself in the desert or you find yourself in the Arctic or whatever, this is how you survive. So I hope so. I hope I'd have those skills.
Let's have your final piece of music then. What are we going to hear?
This is What a Wonderful World by Louis Armstrong. And I've told my hubby that if I die before him, I want this played at my funeral. So I love this song.
Louis Armstrong, What a Wonderful World. So I'm going to give you the books now, Malorie. You get the Bible and the complete works of Shakespeare. And what's your other book going to be?
I think it would have to be Jane Eyre.
It's yours, and a luxury.
My iPad. Can I take my iPad?
No, you absolutely cannot under any circumstances take your iPad.
Oh, okay. If you're going to be harsh.
I am.
Probably something like a bicycle or something. I think that's probably what I'd take.
Fine, you can have that.
Okay.
And if there was one disc that you would save from the waves, which one would it be?
Louis Armstrong. Because even if I were cast away and by myself, I'd still believe that. It's still a wonderful world.
It's yours. Malorie Blackman, thank you very much for letting us hear your Desert Island discs.
My pleasure.
This is the BBC. Hello, I'm Evan Davis, and I'm here to briefly tell you about my new podcast, Sweet Reason. These are polarised times. Debates on social media are pretty shouty sometimes and can pull to the extremes. So in 6 programmes, we're trying a bit of an experiment. We'll be trying to have reasonable discussions on the most emotive of issues. Topics like patriarchy, or whether people are too ready to take offence these days, identity politics, that kind of thing. I'll be with guests in the studio and out and about as well. And my mission is to foster agreement, or at least to better understand disagreement. So do subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.